Okay, if we take away all that other mess there, here's our labor market production function and our model of the economy, the ASAD model.
Sorry, Nick, can you turn the lights off, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I would like you to do now is kind of what I was just discussing with the other lady just now. This was the original diagram that we drew, and then I showed you how we can have a movement to the right along an AS curve, right? In other words, a shift in aggregate demand increases prices. That increase in prices decreases the real wage rate, leads to an increase in employment and an increase in output. What I would like you to do now is essentially just illustrate the reverse. What happens if there's a decrease in aggregate demand? Okay? A decrease in aggregate demand, use the labor market with sticky nominal wages and a production function to derive the ASAD, the short-run AS relationship. In other words, what happens when aggregate demand shifts to the left and we have sticky nominal wages? Okay, so what I'm asking you to illustrate is AD shifts to the left, right? When you shift labor demand to the left, if prices were to remain unchanged, what is the problem? Well, the quantity of output demanded is less than the quantity of output supplied, right? Quantity demanded at that price level is less than the quantity supplied. So what does that do? That puts downward pressure on prices. As prices start decreasing, but we are assuming, remember, that expectations have not changed, or for whatever reason, right? Our nominal wage is fixed. Okay? So our nominal wage remains the same, but the price level starts decreasing. As the price level starts decreasing, what's going to happen to our real wage? As the denominator gets smaller, what happens to this fraction? It gets bigger. So as the price level starts decreasing, the real wage rate starts increasing. As the real wage rate starts increasing, the quantity of labor demanded starts decreasing. As the quantity of labor demanded starts decreasing, so we start employing less people. As we start employing less people, we start producing less. As we start producing less, we have a movement to the left along our aggregate supply curve. Of course, as the price starts decreasing, of course, the quantity demanded also starts increasing. So we have a movement to the right along our aggregate demand curve. All these things start moving. And ultimately, we're going to arrive. The movements will stop once we get a new point of equilibrium at P1, short-run equilibrium. And at P1, we have some level of employment, L1, and we've got an unchanged nominal wage, WN0 over P1, equal to WR1, which is higher. That lower level of employment, L1, corresponds to some lower level of output being produced, Y1, and Y1 corresponds to our new equilibrium level of output at P1. Of course, with that decrease in employment at that higher real wage rate, there is now pressure from the supply side. right? In other words, we now have people that are unemployed at a high real wage who are prepared to work for a lower real wage and will do so by lowering their nominal real wage demands. So as the nominal real wage demands decrease, so now let's change color. Okay, as nominal real wage demands decrease, so now WN is going to start decreasing. As nominal wages decrease, we have a movement to the right along our labor demand curve. Okay, we start increasing employment. Okay, and a change in nominal wages, in other words, a decrease in nominal wages, does what to our aggregate supply curve? Means at any given price level, we can supply more, right? Our input costs at any given price level are decreasing, so we can supply more. Aggregate supply curve starts shifting to the right, okay? And when does it stop shifting to the right? Well, once we've reached a new nominal wage rate, call it W, in fact, I'm just going to call it WN2. Okay, and at WN2, we will have shifted our aggregate supply curve to such an extent, so our aggregate supply curve shifts to, and I'm just going to call it AS2, with P level P2, right? So our nominal wage rate has adjusted to the point where WN2 over P2 is equal to our original real wage, WR0. We're back at our original level of employment, L0. We've increased employment and output, right? Back to L0 and Y0. We're back at Y0. We have a lower price level and we have a lower nominal wage rate. Everyone happy? Cool. Wrong one. So that finishes our discussion on aggregate supply. Aggregate demand, we've already derived aggregate demand, so a lot of this is just recap. What is aggregate demand? It's a relationship. It shows the quantity of real GDP demanded, and it's the total amount of final goods and services that are produced that people, that everyone in the economy essentially plans to buy. So we're looking at the purchasing side. Okay. These planned expenditures depend on many factors. We've seen that, of course, when we change the price level, if we're dealing with a change in a price level, then we change the quantity. Okay, so in other words, this is a movement along. Okay, however, if we change expectations or we change any of the other components of aggregate demand, so remember, aggregate demand is made up of these, as it says here, the expenditure by South African people would be consumption, businesses would be investment, governments would be something we call G, and foreigners are X minus M. Okay? So any change in expectations, which changes C, or I, any fiscal or monetary policy, which changes G or M, and the world economy, which is going to change X and M. Sorry, not X minus M, just X. X and M. Okay. Oh, I've got here M as in not imports. M here would be money. And M here being imports, of course, as we would normally call imports. Okay, the aggregate demand curve. The higher the price level, the smaller the quantity of real GDP demanded. So we've got a negative relationship. Aggregate demand, the relationship between quantity of real GDP demanded and price level. It's described by the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Why does it slope downwards? There are three reasons. There's the wealth effect, a substitution effect, and then, of course, as it says here, the change in the quantity of real GDP demanded. When the price level rises, the quantity of real GDP demanded decreases. When the price level falls, other things remaining the same, the quantity of real GDP demanded increases. Okay? In other words, the wealth effect, when the price level rises but other things remain the same, real wealth decreases. Okay? So in other words, if prices go up, real wealth goes down. So your wealth is, remember if we're talking about consumption, is equal to A plus B, Y. A is the amount that you consume independent of your income. And A, one of the factors that determines A is your wealth. What is wealth? It's things like past savings and your assets and stuff like that. Now, if the price level is rising, okay, the general price level is rising, but the value of your wealth is not changing. So let's say your wealth was held in as money in the bank. When the price level rises, the real value of the money that you hold in the bank is decreasing, which means your real wealth is decreasing. Okay? So as the price level goes up, you have a real wealth effect, which says that your real wealth decreases. So your consumption, the quantity that you would be consuming as your wealth goes down, will be going down. Okay? So there's a negative relationship. Then there's a substitution effect. And the substitution effect has, it's actually quite complicated because there's a number of different types of substitution effects, but essentially when the price level rises, the interest rate rises. Why does the interest rate rise when the price level rises? Well, we've seen from the money market, right? From a demand side, right? When we have an increase in the price level, what does that do to the real money supply? It decreases real money supply. Sorry, so this is the money market. We're plotting M against R. So when the price level rises, the real money supply decreases. When the real money supply decreases, what happens to the interest rate? It increases. Okay? When the interest rate increases, what does that do to things like investment spending? Investment spending decreases, right? So then there's a negative effect. Okay? What that means is so we no longer therefore choose to invest. Okay? That no longer choosing to invest is a substitution basically away from future goods. Okay? So investment, remember, is in capital for future production. So one of the kinds of substitutions is substitution away from future goods when the price level today goes up. So the price level goes up today, right, which raises interest rates today, means we decrease investment today, right? It means we're substituting away from future goods, right? So that's one of the kinds of substitution effects that happens. The other kind of substitution effect is also, well, actually, I don't want to get into it now, but it has to do with exports and things like that. And we haven't spoken about foreign exchange or anything like that. So I think that's a good enough substitution effect, understanding of the substitution effect for now. Then it said here 3 reasons. The other reason which it doesn't really. Oh, sorry, here's the 3rd reason. Here we go, expectations. Sorry. An increase in expected future income increases the amount of consumption goods that people plan to buy today and increases aggregate demand. Okay, no, that's a shift. That's absolutely not what I was thinking about. Okay, this is what they've called the 3rd factor, which is very inexplicable. But basically, any change in so we've spoken specifically about a wealth effect and a substitution effect. But as I say, that substitution effect actually there's different kinds of substitution effects that we can think about, right? And when they make this third point here, changes in the quantity of real GDP demanded when the price level rises, GDP demanded decreases. Yes, because there are other kinds of substitution effects that take place, okay? Which, they haven't really, when they say 3 reasons here, it's actually more like different kinds of substitutions that are happening, okay? I'm not going to go into what those are without first talking about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and open economy stuff, so exports and imports. So for now, fine, wealth effect and then different types of substitution effects. Okay, and those kinds of substitutions can include this idea of expectations here. In other words, what happens is when the price level goes up today, and you think that might be temporary, for example, that makes the price of consuming stuff today expensive relative to consuming stuff tomorrow if you think the price level will go down. And so you consume less today because of a high price if you think the price level will change tomorrow, go down again, right? So you delay your consumption if you think it's a temporary change in price level, okay? So that's the other kind of substitution that can happen. What then would shift the entire demand curve? Well, a different kind of expectation change. If your expected future income increases, the amount of consumption, if you have an increase in the expected future income, okay, so in other words, we're not dealing with what is the amount that you're earning today. If you expect to earn more in the future, okay, so I expect to get a better job next month, right? Because I expect to get a better job next month, I've already signed the papers, it all looks good. I buy my new car today, right? Knowing that I can pay it off with my higher salary. So regardless of the fact that my income today has not changed, if I expect it to go up tomorrow, I buy my new car today, okay? So that means that the quantity of goods demanded today at the price level today increases, okay? So I consume more today, okay? So that's another way. There's an expectation, change in expectations which can move us along a demand curve, and there's a change in expectations which can shift our demand curve. Then, obviously, fiscal and monetary policy. The other kind of change in expectations is obviously expectations that have to do with investment spending. So if firms expect better conditions in the future, they will change their investment spending decisions today, okay? Then we've got fiscal and monetary policy. So obviously we know that fiscal policy involves either an increase or a decrease in government spending, or an increase in a decrease in taxes. Obviously, if government spending is increasing, it means at any given price level, the quantity demanded will be increasing. So fiscal policy, an increase in government spending will shift aggregate demand to the right. Decrease in taxes shifts aggregate demand to the right. Monetary policy, we know what happens when the Reserve Bank, for example, increases the money supply. An increase in the money supply does what to interest rates? Lowers interest rates. A lower interest rate does what to investment? Increases investment. So without a change in the price level, there's an increase in investment when the Reserve Bank increases money supply. Exactly, right? So monetary and fiscal and monetary policy actions will shift our aggregate demand to the left or to the right. Then it says the world economy, and this has to do with exchange rates. Okay, so we haven't spoken yet about how things like exchange rates shift the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, right? But we know that if there was an increase in X, that's exports, we would shift aggregate demand if that increase in X had nothing to do with our price level. If there was a decrease in M, that would shift our aggregate demand, if that decrease in M had nothing to do with the price level, right? Now, usually change in exports and change in imports has to do with changes in interest rates, okay? So this change in interest rates here, the substitution effect from a change in interest rates, does have export and import effects which can shift the aggregate demand curve, okay? But a movement along the aggregate demand curve, in other words, a change in the price level, can also affect our exports and imports. In other words, if the price of goods in our economy goes down relative to the rest of the world, that means our goods get cheaper. That's likely to boost our exports, right? In which case, lower prices increase exports. That's an increase in aggregate demand. Because of a change in price level, that's a movement along the aggregate demand curve, right? You happy with that idea? However, if we have a change in interest rates, let's say our interest rates go up, and because our interest rates go up, foreigners want to buy our bonds, right? Because foreigners are buying our bonds, okay, our exchange rate starts appreciating. Because our exchange rate starts appreciating, the cost of our goods and services relative to those in the rest of the world gets more expensive. Because they get more expensive, we export less, right? Now, there's a change in exports not because the price level in our economy has changed, but because other things have changed. You get it? So we can have a change in exports and imports that either shifts the aggregate demand curve, or we can have a change in exports and imports because of a change in prices, which is a movement along the demand curve. Are you with me? A little bit with me? Okay. Again, when we talk more about exports and imports and exchange rate stuff, then we'll see all of this in action again. This is just to put it into context for you. We're not going to talk in detail about the world economy. Okay. When we bring our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply together, we have equilibrium. Short run aggregate supply and long run, short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This is our short run equilibrium. Short run equilibrium. When we include aggregate demand with long run aggregate supply, then we're dealing with long run equilibrium. Now, if we are at a position, for example, I'm going to label these 3 points here, A, B, and C. Points A and point C are both short-run equilibrium positions, but they are not a long-run equilibrium position. Only B is the long-run equilibrium, right? Of course, B must correspond with a short-run equilibrium as well. So B is both a short-run and a long-run equilibrium position. But points A and point C are only short-run. What that means is we might stop at point A and point C for a short while. Our economy might remain at that position for a while, but it won't stay there. It will move naturally back towards a position of long-run equilibrium, like point B. So if we're at point A, for example, what can we expect to happen? Short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right, and we will move towards point B. If we are at a position like point C, what can we expect to happen? Short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left, and we move towards point B. Okay? Why would short-run aggregate supply shift? Well, when there's a change in the nominal costs of the inputs into production. At point A, prices have risen, but relative to input costs, they have risen disproportionately. In other words, aggregate prices have gone up, but input costs have, oh, sorry, actually, the explanation I'm giving you now is nonsense, because we've moved to, I'm assuming that we're at point A because of a change in aggregate demand or something like that. But there's nothing on that diagram to suggest that aggregate demand has shifted. So my explanation of why we moved from point A to point C is actually dependent on how we got to point A or point C in the first place. So, but to move towards point B or point C, as it's suggesting, is indicative of a change in aggregate supply. Okay? We could also move to a long-run equilibrium position. We could have moved, and in fact, no. We will always move back to a long-run equilibrium position because of a change in aggregate supply. How we moved away from that long run initially could be because of a change in aggregate supply, short run, or a change in aggregate demand, right? And we don't know how we got there initially, but we'll always have a change using short run aggregate supply, getting back to a point like point B. And it'll always be, if we're moving from point A to point B, it's because our input costs must fall. And if we're moving from point C to point B, it's because our input costs must rise. Okay? So here, if we're away from long run equilibrium at point A, it's saying that our input costs are high relative to aggregate prices, and at C, it's saying that our input costs are low relative to aggregate prices. Okay. How then do we get macroeconomic fluctuations? In other words, how do we end up at point A or point C? So economic growth results from a growing labor force and increasing labor productivity, which together make potential GDP grow. In other words, economic growth is a shift in long-run aggregate supply. Inflation results from a growing quantity of money that outpaces the growth of potential GDP. Okay? Why they've singled out money, I'm not sure, but essentially what we're saying is when aggregate demand increases, what do we end up with? An increase in prices. Okay? If therefore our aggregate demand is growing faster than our economy is growing, we will have inflation. Right? One of the, in terms of the different kinds of economic schools of thought, one of the schools of thought would say that this is primarily a result of money. In other words, growth in money causes aggregate demand to increase faster than output increases. So the ASAD model explains and illustrates economic growth and inflation. How do we get a business cycle? How do we get fluctuations? Well, the business cycle occurs because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply fluctuate, but the money wage rate does not adjust quickly enough to keep GDP at potential GDP. Okay, so returning to our initial diagrams, initial set of diagrams here, what I'm going to do is just do a different document, just to start again from a clean slate. If we've got equilibrium in our economy at some level of output P0 and some level of output Y0 and some price level P0 with AD0 and AS0, then what we're saying is, over time, we're going to be looking at different points of equilibrium in our economy. So if we say start at time 1, and at time 1 we are at this equilibrium position Y0. Okay? So here we are. Y0 at T1. Okay? So aggregate demand, for example, here is at T1. Then in our next period at T2, what happens is aggregate demand increases. So let's just change color here. Aggregate demand increases, T2, AD1 at T2. And our price level increases, P1, and output level Y1. Okay? We've moved upwards along a short-run aggregate supply curve. We've assumed that our nominal wage rate is sticky, right? It hasn't adjusted for this change in prices. What happened then at T2? Well, we moved from output level Y0 to output level Y1. So now we have a higher level of output, Y1, at T2. Okay? But laborers are not, they might not have the full information, access to the full information set when prices change, but slowly they gain access to that information and they update their decisions. What happens to aggregate supply? And let me change color. As wages adjust, aggregate supply shifts to the left, right? And as aggregate supply shifts to the left, we end up with a new point. I'm not drawing this particularly well. Aggregate supply 1, and then we've got a new point of equilibrium, which is at our initial equilibrium level. And let me just extend this aggregate demand curve. And we've now got a higher price. We've now got a higher price level, P3. Okay? So with an adjustment, once we move to the next period, after T2 we get to T3, and at T3 laborers have adjusted their wage demands, increased their nominal wage demands so that their real wages return to the initial level, and we're back at Y0. So at T3 we are back at Y0. Then we say, okay, what about in T4, something happens and business confidence drops and firms start investing less. They're less interested in spending. So investment decreases, so we're going now to T4. At T4, a decrease in investment, AD shifts to AD2 at T4. And our prices decrease to P4. But nominal wages remain the same. Oh, sorry, wait. We're at this equilibrium. Let me redo that again. So from AD1, we shift to AD2 here. AD2 at T4. Okay, so we've got AS1 and AD2. Here's our new equilibrium. Our prices decrease from P3 and our output decreases. Why does our output decrease? I'll call that Y2. Why does our output decrease? Our output has decreased because nominal wages remain sticky. As prices go down, real wages go up. Employers employ less people with sticky nominal wages. Okay? So in T4, with that decrease in investment sentiment, we've now gone down to Y2. Okay? But of course, that leads to unemployment, and that unemployment, what happens? Employees realize that in fact, real wages have risen with that decrease in the price level. They're happy to accept lower real wages now that they know that prices have decreased. So, with a decrease in nominal wages, aggregate supply shifts. Aggregate supply shifts from AS1 to AS2 in the next time period. So now we're dealing with time period 5 at T5. And we return back to our initial equilibrium level with AD2 intersecting AS2. And we're back to Y0 at T5. So now if we plot all these points, what do we end up with? Well, we've got no economic growth over time, so let's go with, here's our trend. The trend is no growth. And what has happened around the trend? Here's our actual real GDP. And the trend, of course, is our potential GDP. Potential real GDP, of course. So we've got fluctuations about the trend. This would be called a peak. This would be called a trough. This period is a recession. Recession. Not, so in other words, that's a recession. Did I spell that right? I don't know. Okay, so we've got a recession. So recession comes in two forms here. We've got a recession that was because of a backward shift in aggregate supply. We've got a recession that was because of a backward shift in aggregate demand, right? So decrease in supply, decrease in demand, both of those are causing us recessions. What causes our cyclical movement away from potential GDP? It was changes in prices at an aggregate level that were not matched by changes in input costs at the same moment in time. In other words, there was stickiness in prices, stickiness in price adjustments, and that stickiness in price adjustments led to a cyclical pattern in our economy. Oh, not what I wanted. So the business cycle occurs because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply fluctuate, and the money wage rate does not quickly adjust to keep real GDP at potential GDP. Does that sentence there make sense in light of this diagram? You get what I'm saying? Okay? This diagram here is a discussion of this little sentence here. So here we've got similar, in your textbook it shows plotting a similar story to what we've plotted here, but they've just separated out the diagrams. And again, the same story, just different set of diagrams. And then finally we end with these different schools of thought. Now we've got 5 minutes, and yeah, I don't know if I can really add any value to these schools of thoughts unless you sort of have a read read what the textbook says, right? And then tomorrow, if you've got any questions about it, ask me. Because, I mean, I could sit here and talk all day about the differences in schools of thought, and it would be, unless you're interested in it, it would be incredibly boring, I'm sure. And it wouldn't necessarily add to any value to your test, because you're just going to get tested in terms of what the textbook says, right? So you can read what the textbook says. If there's anything confusing in there and you want to run it by me, then we can do that. Otherwise, I'm just going to skip these last couple of slides and say that's it for chapter 28.